There comes a point in your life when being around people starts to feel more exhausting than being alone, when noise drains you instead of energizing you, and when the crowd no longer feels like safety, but like pressure. At that moment, society is quick to label you. They call you withdrawn, detached, depressed, as if stepping away from the noise must mean something is wrong with you. But Carl Jung saw this differently. He understood that not all withdrawals are escapes, some are awakenings. Jung believed that the most important transformations in a human life do not happen in groups, applause, or approval, but in silence, in separation, in moments when a person dares to stand alone long enough to hear their own psyche speak. The loner in Jung's psychology is not weak, antisocial, or broken. The loner is early. Early in a process most people never complete, because there is a difference between being alone and being lost. Loneliness is pain. Solitude is initiation. Most people stay surrounded not because they are fulfilled, but because separation forces them to confront parts of themselves they have spent years avoiding. Their shadow, their unlived life, their false persona, their borrowed values. The crowd protects them from this confrontation. Silence removes that protection, and this is why solitude feels dangerous. Jung warned that a person who never separates from the collective mind never becomes an individual. They become a function, a role, a mask, and behind that mask, something essential slowly suffocates. The loner senses this suffocation instinctively. They don't always understand it intellectually, but they feel it in their bones. So they step away. Not because they hate people, not because they fear connection, but because something inside them refuses to die quietly. This episode is not about romanticizing isolation. It is about understanding the psychology behind the loner, why certain individuals are drawn to silence, why they lose energy in the crowd, why creativity, depth, and authenticity often require separation, and why Jung believed that the most dangerous individual in society is the one who no longer needs the tribe to feel whole. You will discover why neurosis can be a call rather than a sickness, why the persona must die before the self can breathe, why shadow work cannot be done in performance, and why wholeness, not perfection, is the true goal of a meaningful life. If you've ever felt that the world is too loud for your mind, if you've ever sensed that being alone was not decay, but preparation, if you've ever suspected that your withdrawal had a deeper purpose, then this episode is for you. Stay with the silence. Stay with the discomfort. Because in Jung's psychology, the loner is not running away from life. They are walking straight toward it. 1. The difference between loneliness and solitude. Most people use the words loneliness and solitude as if they mean the same thing, but in Jungian psychology, confusing the two is one of the greatest psychological errors a person can make. Loneliness is not defined by the absence of people. It is defined by disconnection from meaning. You can be surrounded, admired, constantly spoken to, and still feel deeply lonely, because loneliness is what happens when the most important parts of you have no place to speak. Solitude, on the other hand, is not absence, it is presence, directed inward. Carl Jung understood this distinction with precision. He observed that loneliness comes not from having no one around, but from being unable to communicate the things that feel essential to your inner life. When your values, intuitions, questions, and inner images have no language in the world around you, you begin to feel isolated, even in company. This is why some people feel most lonely at parties, in relationships, or inside social success. The loner senses this early. They notice that constant interaction does not bring relief, but fragmentation. That conversation stays on the surface. That connection feels conditional, that something important inside them remains untouched, unspoken, and unrecognized. Over time, this creates a subtle inner tension, not sadness, but incongruence. Life feels crowded, yet strangely hollow. This is where solitude begins to call. Unlike loneliness, solitude is chosen. It is an intentional withdrawal, not from people, but from falseness. In solitude, you are no longer forced to compress yourself into what can be explained, accepted, or approved. You no longer need to translate your inner world into socially acceptable fragments. You are allowed to think in images, contradictions, emotions, and symbols, the natural language of the psyche. Loneliness drains, solitude restores. Loneliness makes you desperate for contact. Solitude makes you selective. When you are lonely, you seek people to escape yourself. When you are in solitude, you step away from people to encounter yourself more fully. One is hunger, the other is nourishment. One weakens identity, the other strengthens it. This is why Jung never pathologized solitude itself. He saw that for certain individuals, especially those with a rich inner life, too much external stimulation creates psychic exhaustion. The mind becomes cluttered. The soul becomes muted. Solitude becomes necessary not for escape, but for psychological hygiene. It allows the psyche to reorganize, to speak in its own rhythm without interruption. The tragedy is that society does not teach this distinction. Anyone who steps back is labeled antisocial. Anyone who chooses silence is assumed to be broken. Anyone who does not constantly participate is suspected of depression. But Jung warned against this reflex. Not every withdrawal is regression. Some withdrawals are preparation. The loner does not withdraw because they cannot connect. They withdraw because they can no longer tolerate shallow connection. In solitude, something important happens. You stop trying to be understood immediately. You stop translating yourself prematurely. You allow your inner world to mature before exposing it to noise. This creates depth, and depth cannot survive constant interaction. Loneliness says, I need someone to fill this emptiness. Solitude says, I need space to hear what is already inside me. Only one of these leads to wholeness. This is why the first step in understanding the psychology of the loner is not to ask, why are you alone? But to ask, what are you protecting? What inner process requires silence? What truth needs space before it can be spoken? Because in Jung's view, solitude is not a symptom of emptiness. It is often the sign of a psyche preparing to become whole. If you feel drawn to being alone, the question is not whether something is wrong with you. The question is whether something important inside you is asking, quietly, to be heard. 2. The persona, the death of the mask. Every human being learns very early that survival in society requires adaptation. You discover which behaviors are rewarded, which emotions are tolerated, which opinions are applauded, and which parts of you should remain hidden. Slowly, almost unconsciously, you construct what Carl Jung called the persona, the social mask you wear to function, belong, and avoid friction. At first, this mask is useful. It helps you navigate the world. It protects you. It keeps you employable, acceptable, and understood. But what begins as protection quietly becomes imprisonment. Over time, the persona hardens. You stop using it strategically and start living inside it. You become the role instead of the person behind it. You speak in ways that are safe rather than true. You suppress thoughts that feel dangerous rather than exploring them. You adjust your reactions not according to your inner reality, but according to what will keep the peace. And without noticing, your life becomes a performance. This is where the loner begins to feel suffocated, not because society is evil, but because constant acting exhausts the psyche. Maintaining the persona requires continuous self-editing. You are always watching yourself, correcting yourself, filtering yourself. The inner world becomes secondary to the outer image. And when this imbalance persists for too long, something essential begins to wither. Jung was clear about this danger. He warned that a person who identifies too strongly with the persona becomes alienated from their true self. They may appear successful, likable, and functional, yet feel strangely hollow, restless, or anxious beneath the surface. This is not depression in the medical sense. It is psychic starvation. The real self is no longer receiving oxygen. Solitude is where this process reverses. When you step away from constant interaction, the persona loses its function. There is no audience to manage, no expectations to meet, no reactions to predict, and without reinforcement, the mask begins to loosen. At first, this feels unsettling. You may feel awkward, undefined, even exposed, because the persona was doing more work than you realized. But this discomfort is a sign of health. In solitude, you stop rehearsing who you are supposed to be and begin encountering who you actually are. Thoughts arise that would never survive social translation. Emotions surface that were long suppressed for being inconvenient. Desires, fears, and intuitions emerge without censorship. This is not regression, it is recovery. The death of the persona is not dramatic, it is quiet, gradual, and irreversible. You begin noticing that you no longer have the same tolerance for pretending. Small talk feels heavier. Social performance feels costly. You crave environments where you don't have to explain yourself, soften yourself, or fragment yourself to be accepted. This is not arrogance. It is psychic self-preservation. Jung emphasized that the persona is not evil, but it must remain a mask, not an identity. When the mask dominates, the self suffocates. Solitude restores the correct order. The persona becomes a tool again, something you put on when needed and remove when no longer necessary. This is why the loner steps back, not to reject society, but to survive it intact. In silence, you begin rebuilding a relationship with yourself that is not mediated by approval. You learn what you think when you are not reacting, what you feel when you are not suppressing, what you value when no one is watching, and slowly, something authentic begins to breathe again. The danger of the persona is not that it hides you from others, it hides you from yourself. Solitude tears that veil gently but firmly. And once you have experienced life without the mask, it becomes impossible to fully return to unconscious performance. You may still play roles, but you are no longer possessed by them. This is the beginning of psychological honesty, and in Jung's view, no individuation is possible until the mask loosens and the true self is given space to emerge. If the first stage of the loner's path is choosing solitude, this second stage is allowing the persona to die, because only when the mask falls can the real work truly begin. 3. Escaping mass-mindedness. One of the most uncomfortable truths Carl Jung ever articulated is that the crowd does not elevate the individual, it levels them, not upward, but downward. The collective mind does not reward depth, originality, or inner coherence. It rewards agreement, repetition, and emotional conformity. And because belonging feels safer than standing alone, most people quietly surrender their individuality without ever realizing it. Jung called this mass-mindedness. It is not simply being part of society. It is allowing the psyche to be organized by the crowd rather than by the self. When you are immersed in the collective for too long, something subtle happens. Your thoughts begin to sound familiar, not because they are true, but because they are shared. Your opinions arrive pre-packaged. Your values are reinforced not by reflection, but by repetition. And slowly, the inner voice that once questioned, doubted, and explored is replaced by borrowed certainty. This is why the crowd feels comforting and dangerous. The mass offers relief from responsibility. When everyone thinks alike, no one has to think deeply. When everyone reacts the same way, no one has to confront themselves. The individual dissolves into consensus, and with that dissolution comes a strange sense of safety. If everyone agrees, how wrong can you be? Jung's answer was clear. Very wrong, together. He warned that intelligence, morality, and psychological health decline when submerged too deeply in the collective. The crowd does not tolerate deviation well. It pulls everything toward the lowest common denominator, because uniformity is easier to manage than individuality. To think differently is to risk isolation. To feel differently is to invite suspicion. This is where the loner's path diverges. The loner does not withdraw because they feel superior. They withdraw because they feel pressure. Pressure to simplify their thoughts. Pressure to flatten their perceptions. Pressure to abandon nuance in favor of slogans. Over time, this pressure becomes unbearable for anyone with a strong inner life. Solitude becomes an act of resistance. Jung famously said that resistance to the organized mass can only come from the person who is as well organized in their individuality as the mass itself is in its collective identity. This is a crucial point. Separation alone is not enough. Isolation without inner structure leads to confusion. What the loner seeks is not absence of influence, but inner organization. In solitude, this organization begins. Away from constant reinforcement, the psyche starts to differentiate. Thoughts slow down. Contradictions are allowed to exist without immediate resolution. Questions are explored without being shut down by social pressure. You begin to notice where your beliefs came from and whether they actually belong to you. This process is deeply unsettling. You realize how much of what you once defended passionately was never truly yours. How many emotional reactions were inherited. How often outrage replaced understanding. How frequently identity was borrowed from group affiliation rather than inner conviction. This realization can feel like losing ground, but it is actually the beginning of psychological independence. The crowd offers certainty, the loner accepts uncertainty, and in doing so, gains depth. Jung did not idealize isolation, but he insisted that individuation, the process of becoming a real individual, cannot occur within constant collective immersion. The psyche needs distance to see clearly. Without distance, you cannot tell where society ends and you begin. This is why true originality is rare. Not because people lack intelligence, but because they fear separation. The cost of thinking independently is loneliness, misunderstanding, and sometimes rejection. The reward, however, is something far greater. Internal coherence. A sense of self that does not rise and fall with trends, outrage cycles, or collective moods. The loner pays this cost consciously. They step away from the emotional contagion of the mass. They stop outsourcing moral judgment. They resist the pressure to react instantly. In silence, they allow ideas to mature instead of echo. This does not make them detached from reality. It makes them anchored in it. A person trapped in mass-mindedness is easy to mobilize, easy to frighten, easy to direct. But a person who has organized themselves internally becomes difficult to move unless they choose to move. This is the quiet danger Jung was pointing toward. The loner is not antisocial. They are anti-dissolution. They refuse to dissolve into the collective psyche at the cost of their own individuation. They understand that to preserve intelligence, conscience, and creativity, separation is sometimes necessary. Not forever. Not in bitterness, but long enough to remember how to think. Escaping mass-mindedness is not about rejecting society. It is about refusing to let society replace your inner authority. And for Jung, this refusal was not rebellion. It was psychological responsibility. 4. The shadow work. There comes a moment in solitude when excuses run out. When there is no one left to blame, no environment to point at, no relationship to hide behind, And in that moment, something uncomfortable begins to surface. Not from the outside, but from within. This is the moment Jung believed most people avoid their entire lives, because this is where you meet the shadow. The shadow is not evil, it is unlived life. Carl Jung described the shadow as the parts of your personality that were rejected, suppressed, or denied because they did not fit the image you needed to survive. Anger that was never allowed to speak. Ambition that was labeled selfish. Vulnerability that felt dangerous. Aggression that was punished. Desire that felt unacceptable. None of these parts disappeared. They were simply pushed underground. And what is pushed underground does not become weaker. It becomes autonomous. As long as you are surrounded by others, it is easy to keep the shadow hidden. Social roles provide cover. Distraction dulls awareness. Blame offers relief. You can tell yourself that your problems come from circumstances, from people, from bad luck. But solitude removes these buffers. Alone, the psyche has no one else to project onto, and so the shadow steps forward. This is why solitude often feels heavier than expected. Old memories resurface without invitation. Uncomfortable impulses appear without explanation. Patterns repeat themselves in your thoughts until you can no longer ignore them. This is not regression. This is revelation. Jung warned that when the shadow is ignored, it does not stay passive. It acts out. It sabotages relationships. It erupts as rage, envy, self-destruction, or moral hypocrisy. People who believe they are good without ever confronting their darkness are often the most dangerous, not because they are evil, but because they are unconscious. The loner does not run from this confrontation. In solitude, you are forced to recognize a hard truth. Much of what you dislike in others' lives, unacknowledged within you. The arrogance you despise, the weakness you judge, the manipulation you resent. These reactions are not random. They are mirrors, projections of the shadow onto the world. Shadow work begins when projection ends. This is where responsibility returns. Instead of asking, "Why do people always treat me this way?" you ask, "What part of me keeps recreating this pattern?" Instead of condemning traits in others, you examine their presence in yourself, not to indulge them, but to integrate them. Integration is the key word. The goal of shadow work is not to eliminate darkness. That is impossible. The goal is to bring it into consciousness so it can no longer operate behind your back. Aggression, when unconscious, becomes cruelty. When integrated, it becomes boundaries. Desire, when unconscious, becomes addiction. When integrated, it becomes vitality. Fear, when unconscious, becomes paralysis. When integrated, it becomes discernment. Solitude makes this integration possible. Without an audience, there is no need to maintain moral appearance. Without constant reaction, you can observe your inner movements without judgment. You begin to see yourself more honestly, not as who you should be, but as who you are. This honesty is painful at first. It dismantles self-image, it humbles, it destabilizes, but it also consolidates power. A person who has faced their shadow is no longer surprised by themselves. They know their capacity for destruction, and therefore their capacity for restraint. They know their hunger for power, and therefore how to channel it constructively. They know their weakness, and therefore where discipline is required. This is why Jung insisted that wholeness matters more than goodness. A good person who has never faced their shadow is fragile. Under pressure, they break. A whole person who has integrated their darkness remains grounded. They do not need to prove virtue. They live with awareness. Most people prefer moral superiority to psychological honesty. The loner chooses the opposite. In silence, you learn to sit with uncomfortable truths without immediately correcting them. You allow contradictions to exist. You accept that you are not pure, not simple, not one-dimensional. And paradoxically, this acceptance makes you more stable, not less. Because denial fragments the psyche, integration unifies it. Shadow work is not a phase you complete and move past. It is an ongoing discipline. Each time life triggers you strongly, the shadow is asking to be seen again. Each time you react disproportionately, something unconscious is requesting attention. Solitude gives you the space to listen. This is why Jung believed that individuation, becoming who you truly are, cannot happen without shadow work. Without it, growth remains superficial. Personality remains split. Strength remains borrowed. The loner understands this intuitively. They step away not to escape responsibility, but to assume it fully. They stop blaming the world for what has never been examined within. And in doing so, they begin the most difficult and transformative work a human being can undertake. Not self-improvement, but self-integration. The shadow does not disappear when confronted. It becomes an ally, disciplined, contained, and conscious. And once you have walked through this territory honestly, something changes forever. You are no longer afraid of your own depth. You no longer need to project your darkness outward. You carry your contradictions without collapse. This is not comfort, this is strength. And in Jung's psychology, no one becomes truly whole or truly free without passing through this dark, necessary gate. 5. Individuation, the ultimate goal. Everything in Jung's psychology leads to this point. All the concepts, the persona, the shadow, projection, solitude, withdrawal from the mass, are not ends in themselves. They are stages. Individuation is the destination. And it is not self-improvement in the modern sense. It is not becoming better according to social standards. It is becoming yourself, fully, consciously, and without apology. Individuation is the process of separation, not separation from people in a physical sense, but separation from unconscious identification, from parental expectations you never questioned, from cultural values you inherited without examination, from collective opinions that shaped you before you were old enough to resist them. Most people never individuate because they never separate. They remain extensions of family systems, social roles, and collective moods. Jung was clear about this. You cannot discover who you are while you are still lost in who you were told to be. This is why individuation requires solitude. As long as you are constantly embedded in relationships, roles, and expectations, your psyche is busy adapting. It is responding, adjusting, pleasing, defending. There is no space for differentiation, no room for the deeper self to emerge. The loner feels this instinctively. They sense that something essential cannot be born in noise, so they withdraw, not to disappear, but to listen. In solitude, the inner voice grows louder, not the ego, but the deeper organizing center Jung called the self. This voice does not shout, it does not argue, it communicates through intuition, symbols, dreams, recurring longings, and persistent dissatisfaction with the life you are living. Individuation begins when you stop silencing this voice. This is where the process becomes uncomfortable. To individuate is to disappoint people. It is to outgrow identities that once kept you safe. It is to realize that the life you are expected to live may not be the life you are meant to live. This realization often comes with guilt, fear, and confusion, not because it is wrong, but because it threatens belonging. The crowd rewards conformity. Individuation demands courage. Jung emphasized that individuation does not make you antisocial. It makes you real. You stop relating from roles and start relating from substance. But before that can happen, you must tolerate a period of aloneness, psychological and sometimes physical, where you are no longer reinforced by familiar reflections. This is the price. You begin asking questions that have no immediate answers. What do I want when no one is watching? What kind of life feels meaningful, even if it is misunderstood? What am I willing to sacrifice comfort for? These questions destabilize the old structure of your identity. You feel less certain for a time, less defined. This is not regression, it is reorganization. The psyche is dismantling borrowed architecture to build something internal. Most people panic here. They rush back to the familiar. They call the discomfort a crisis, a depression, a mistake. But Jung saw it differently. He believed this disorientation is a necessary stage of growth, a sign that the old personality is no longer sufficient. The loner stays. They endure the ambiguity. They allow the new structure to form slowly. They resist the urge to prematurely define themselves again just to relieve anxiety. This patience is rare, and it is exactly what allows individuation to complete itself. Over time, something solid emerges. You no longer feel pulled in multiple directions. Your choices begin to align. Your energy consolidates. You stop living reactively and start living coherently. This does not make life easier, but it makes it meaningful. Suffering becomes purposeful. Sacrifice becomes intelligible. Effort feels directed. This is individuation in action. You are no longer trying to be everything. You are trying to be whole. Jung insisted that wholeness matters more than perfection. Perfection is a social fantasy, clean, polished, and lifeless. Wholeness is real. It includes contradiction, limitation, darkness, and strength held together consciously. A whole person does not need constant approval because their identity is internally anchored. This is why individuation cannot happen in the crowd. The crowd fragments you, solitude integrates you, and when individuation reaches maturity, something paradoxical occurs. You return to the world, but differently. You are no longer absorbed by it. You participate without dissolving. You relate without losing yourself. You stand among others without surrendering your center. The loner was never meant to remain isolated forever. They were meant to become, and individuation is the moment when solitude has done its work, when separation gives way to presence, and the individual stands in the world not as a mask, not as a function, but as a self. 6. Projection. Withdrawal. One of the most difficult moments in psychological maturity is the realization that much of what you love, hate, admire, or despise in others never truly belonged to them. It belonged to you, and as long as it was projected outward, you were protected from seeing it clearly. Carl Jung considered projection one of the psyche's most primitive defenses, not because it is malicious, but because it spares the ego from responsibility. Projection is how the unconscious speaks when it is ignored. When you are immersed in relationships and constant interaction, projection is easy. You idealize others with qualities you have not yet claimed in yourself. You demonize others for traits you refuse to acknowledge within. You fall in love not with the person in front of you, but with an image generated by your own psyche. You feel intense resentment, not because the other is unbearable, but because they carry what you have disowned. As long as there are others to project onto, the inner work can be postponed. Solitude ends this postponement. When you step away from constant relationship dynamics, the screen disappears. There is no one left to carry your unlived ambition, your suppressed anger, your denied sensitivity, your unclaimed authority. The psyche turns inward, and suddenly the traits you once saw out there begin to appear in here. This is often experienced as discomfort, shame, or disorientation, not because something new has emerged, but because something familiar can no longer hide. Projection withdrawal is painful because it dismantles illusion. You begin to see how often admiration was compensation, how often hatred was self-rejection, how often dependency was an attempt to avoid inner development. This realization can feel humiliating because it strips away moral superiority and emotional innocence. But Jung insisted that without this humiliation, there is no growth, only repetition. The loner reaches this stage inevitably. In solitude, you cannot sustain the fantasy that others are the source of your inner states. No one is there to blame for your dissatisfaction. No one is there to idealize as your missing half. The psyche demands ownership, and ownership is heavy. This is where maturity begins. You stop saying, "They make me feel this way," and start asking, "What in me is reacting so strongly?" You stop assuming others possess what you lack and begin cultivating it within yourself. This does not make relationships colder, it makes them cleaner. When projections are withdrawn, others are finally allowed to be real, not saviors, not enemies, not containers for your unconscious material, just human beings. And in this clarity, attachment loosens its grip. You no longer cling to people to complete you. You no longer need them to carry your darkness or your light. This is why projection withdrawal often feels like loss. You lose intensity, you lose fantasy, you lose emotional drama. But what you gain is something far more valuable: autonomy. Your emotional reactions soften, not because you care less, but because you're no longer at war with yourself through others. Relationships stop being battlegrounds for inner conflict. Attraction becomes grounded. Conflict becomes informative instead of explosive. Jung believed that projection withdrawal is one of the most painful stages of individuation, precisely because it ends innocence. You can no longer pretend that your suffering is entirely caused by the world. You see your own participation, your own blind spots, your own unfinished business. The loner does not escape this stage, they endure it. In silence, they reclaim the traits they once assigned to others: strength, vulnerability, creativity, authority, sensitivity, aggression. They stop scattering their psyche across relationships and begin consolidating it internally. This consolidation is not narcissism, it is integration. And with integration comes stability. You become less reactive, less possessive, less dependent on emotional feedback. You are no longer searching for yourself in others. You are building yourself from within. This is why Jung insisted that maturity requires solitude. Without space, projection cannot be seen. Without silence, it cannot be withdrawn. And without withdrawal, the psyche remains fragmented, powerful in appearance, but unstable at its core. Projection withdrawal is not the end of love. It is the end of illusion. And when illusion dissolves, something quieter and stronger takes its place. The capacity to relate without losing yourself, to connect without surrendering authorship, and to stand alone without feeling incomplete. 7. The privilege of a lifetime. At a certain stage of inner development, solitude stops feeling like a reaction to the world and starts revealing itself as a choice, not an escape, but a commitment. A commitment to something most people never consciously pursue: becoming who they truly are. Carl Jung called this the privilege of a lifetime, and he chose that word carefully. Privilege does not mean ease, it means access. Access earned through courage, patience, and the willingness to disappoint expectations that were never aligned with your nature. Most people live as adaptations. They adapt to family systems, to cultural ideals, to social rewards and punishments, and over time this adaptation hardens into identity. They become who they are expected to be because it is safer, faster, and socially rewarded. Authenticity, in contrast, demands something uncomfortable: separation. Not permanent isolation, but a decisive withdrawal from constant reinforcement so the inner voice can finally be heard without interference. The loner understands this intuitively. They sense that living truthfully will cost them approval, that depth will not always be welcomed, that walking their own path may be misunderstood, labeled selfish, cold, or distant, and yet something inside them refuses to trade authenticity for acceptance. This refusal is not arrogance, it is fidelity to the self. Solitude becomes the proving ground of that fidelity. When you are alone, there is no reward for pretending, no applause for saying the right thing, no punishment for thinking differently. You are confronted with a simple but ruthless question. Who are you when no one is there to validate your choices? And over time, as you continue choosing what feels true over what feels safe, a quiet confidence begins to form. This confidence is not loud. It does not demand recognition. It does not seek permission. It comes from alignment. Jung believed that neurosis often arises when a person lives a life that contradicts their inner nature. Symptoms emerge not as enemies, but as signals, warnings that something essential is being sacrificed for conformity. The loner responds to this signal not by numbing it, but by listening. They step back from the noise long enough to hear what their psyche has been asking for all along. This is why solitude for the loner is not deprivation, it is prioritization. They choose depth over popularity, meaning over momentum, integrity over image, and while this choice may narrow their social world, it expands their inner one. They stop performing their life and start inhabiting it. Decisions feel heavier, but also clearer. Sacrifices feel real, but also purposeful. This is the privilege Jung was pointing toward, not the privilege of superiority, but the privilege of coherence, of waking up and recognizing yourself in the life you are living, of no longer feeling divided between who you are and who you present, of standing alone without feeling diminished because your sense of worth is internally sourced. The loner is not antisocial, they are anti-falsehood. They are willing to endure misunderstanding in exchange for authenticity, willing to lose shallow connections to preserve inner truth, willing to walk slowly while others rush because their direction is not borrowed. And when this choice is sustained long enough, something remarkable happens. You stop envying other lives. You stop craving external confirmation. You stop fearing that you are missing out, because you are no longer living reactively, you are living deliberately. Jung understood that not everyone is called to this path. Individuation is demanding, and comfort is abundant. But for those who feel the pull towards solitude, the pull is not random. It is an invitation, not to withdraw from life, but to claim it fully. The privilege of a lifetime is not being admired, it is being real, and the loner accepts this privilege with both its costs and its rewards. They understand that approval fades, trends die, and roles collapse. But authenticity once lived cannot be taken away. 8. The neurosis as a call. At some point when a person steps away from the collective rhythm, society reaches for a familiar explanation. It calls the withdrawal unhealthy. It labels the discomfort pathological. Anxiety becomes a disorder. Depression becomes a defect. And the loner is encouraged, gently or aggressively, to return to normal as quickly as possible. But Carl Jung refused to see neurosis this way. He believed that many psychological symptoms are not signs of sickness, but signals of truth being ignored. Neurosis, in Jung's view, is often the soul protesting a life that has become false. When your outer life contradicts your inner nature for too long, the psyche does not remain silent. It speaks through tension, restlessness, exhaustion, anxiety, emptiness. These symptoms are not random malfunctions. They are communications, messages saying something essential is being sacrificed. The tragedy is that modern culture treats these messages as enemies to be silenced rather than signals to be understood. The loner experiences this conflict acutely. They feel drained by routines that others tolerate easily. They feel anxious in environments that reward conformity. They feel depressed, not because life is meaningless, but because the life they are living is not theirs. Their nervous system reacts not to danger, but to incongruence. And because society values adjustment over authenticity, the loner is often told that something is wrong with them. Jung's response was radical. Perhaps something is wrong with the life. He observed that neurosis often appears when a person has outgrown their current form of existence, but has not yet found the courage to leave it. The psyche is caught between who it has been and who it must become. This tension is painful, but it is also purposeful. It is the pressure of transformation. Solitude allows this pressure to be interpreted rather than medicated. When you are alone, removed from constant distraction and explanation, the symptoms do not disappear immediately. They intensify. Anxiety becomes clearer. Sadness becomes heavier. But instead of treating these states as enemies, the loner begins to ask a different question. What is this feeling asking of me? Not how to eliminate it, but how to listen to it. This is where neurosis becomes guidance. Anxiety may be pointing to a life lived against instinct. Depression may be signaling the death of an old identity. Restlessness may be the refusal of the psyche to remain contained. Jung believed that if these signals are honored rather than suppressed, they often lead a person toward individuation. The symptoms push the individual out of adaptation and into authenticity. They force separation. They demand inner reorganization. And while this process is uncomfortable, it is not meaningless. The loner understands this intuitively. They do not withdraw because they are sick. They withdraw because something in them refuses to cooperate with a sick structure. This does not mean romanticizing suffering. Jung was clear that pain alone does not transform. Conscious engagement does. Neurosis becomes destructive only when it is denied, numbed, or externalized endlessly. When it is faced honestly with patience and reflection, it becomes a catalyst. Solitude creates the conditions for this honesty. Without social pressure to appear functional, you can allow discomfort to exist without immediately fixing it. You can trace symptoms back to their source. You can see how much of your distress comes from living in contradiction. Saying yes when your psyche is screaming no, performing roles that drain you, suppressing parts of yourself that demand expression. This insight changes the relationship to suffering. You stop seeing yourself as broken. You stop seeing symptoms as enemies. You start seeing them as messengers. And messengers, even painful ones, carry information. Jung warned that a society obsessed with adjustment produces well-adapted individuals who are profoundly unindividuated. They function, but they do not live. They comply, but they are not whole. The loner's neurosis threatens this arrangement because it refuses to be normalized. This is why the loner often feels misunderstood. Their pain does not respond to superficial solutions. Their distress cannot be resolved by returning to the same patterns that caused it. Something deeper is required, a restructuring of life from the inside out. And that restructuring cannot happen in constant motion. It requires silence. It requires withdrawal. It requires courage. Neurosis, in Jung's psychology, is not the end of the road. It is the sign that the road you are on no longer leads where your psyche needs to go. The loner listens to this sign, even when it is frightening, even when it costs stability, even when it demands letting go of an identity that once felt secure. This is why solitude is not decay for the loner. It is diagnosis, and diagnosis, when taken seriously, is the first step toward healing, not back into conformity, but forward into wholeness. 9. The introvert's power source. One of Carl Jung's most misunderstood contributions to psychology is his distinction between introversion and extroversion. Most people treat these words as personality labels, shy or social, quiet or outgoing. But Jung meant something far deeper. He was describing where your psychic energy is restored, not how you behave, but where you refuel. This distinction changes everything. Carl Jung observed that the introverted psyche does not gain strength from stimulation, it loses it. The more noise, interaction, and external demand, the more the inner reserves are drained. Silence, on the other hand, does not weaken the introvert. It repairs them. It brings the psyche back into balance. The loner feels this truth viscerally. In crowds, something subtle but real happens. Thoughts become fragmented. Sensitivity increases. The mind becomes reactive rather than reflective. Even positive social experiences leave a residue of fatigue. This is not social anxiety. It is energetic economics. The introverted psyche is spending more than it is earning. Society rarely understands this. The world is built for extraversion. Visibility is rewarded. Participation is expected. Constant engagement is treated as health. And so the loner is often pressured to override their nature, to push through exhaustion, to socialize more, to get used to it. But Jung warned that violating your psychological orientation is not growth. It is self-betrayal. The introvert's strength comes from withdrawal, not avoidance. Withdrawal. In silence, the psyche turns inward and begins to regenerate. Thoughts slow, inner images surface, meaning consolidates, energy returns. What felt overwhelming in the crowd becomes manageable again. Decisions become clearer. Emotional noise settles. The nervous system recalibrates. This is why solitude is not optional for the loner. It is maintenance. When the introverted psyche is denied its power source, symptoms appear. Irritability, brain fog, emotional numbness, anxiety, depression. These are often misdiagnosed as flaws when they are actually signs of energetic depletion. The psyche is exhausted from living in a way that contradicts its orientation. Jung insisted that respecting one's psychological type is not weakness, it is intelligence. A person who understands how they recharge stops fighting themselves. They stop forcing extroverted solutions onto introverted systems. They stop mistaking exhaustion for pathology. They begin organizing life around recovery instead of constant output. The loner does this instinctively. They create space, they limit exposure, they protect silence, they choose depth over frequency, and as a result, something paradoxical happens. Their impact increases, because when they do engage, they are present, focused, precise. Their words carry weight because they are not spent casually. This is the introvert's hidden advantage. While others scatter energy across endless interaction, the loner concentrates it. While others react in real time, the loner reflects before responding. While others chase stimulation, the loner cultivates insight. Over time, this leads to originality, not because the loner tries to be different, but because their thinking is not constantly overwritten by noise. Creativity requires energy. Clarity requires energy. Individuation requires energy, and energy must be sourced correctly. Jung never argued that introversion is superior to extroversion. He argued that confusion about one's nature is destructive. When introverts try to live like extroverts, they burn out. When extroverts try to live like introverts, they stagnate. Health comes from alignment, not imitation. The loner learns to honor this alignment. They stop apologizing for needing space. They stop explaining their silence. They stop forcing themselves into environments that extract more than they give. This does not make them antisocial. It makes them sustainable. In a world that confuses constant output with value, the loner becomes quietly powerful by managing energy rather than chasing approval. They understand that strength is not endless exposure. It is intelligent withdrawal followed by intentional engagement. Silence is not emptiness for the introvert. It is the power source. And when you stop treating your nature as a flaw and start treating it as a system to be optimized, something stabilizes inside you. You no longer feel broken. You feel designed to move differently, to recover deeply, to contribute selectively. This is not retreat from life. It is strategic participation. 10. Creativity and the unconscious. Most people believe creativity is a product of effort, intelligence, or constant thinking. But Jung saw it as something far older and far less obedient. Creativity does not originate in the conscious mind. It rises from beneath it. From the same depth that produces dreams, symbols, intuitions, and sudden insights that arrive fully formed without asking for permission. This depth is the unconscious. Carl Jung insisted that the intellect does not create, it selects, edits, and organizes. True creation happens elsewhere, and that elsewhere cannot be accessed in noise. It cannot speak over constant stimulation. It requires silence, the way a seed requires darkness. The loner understands this instinctively. When the external world becomes quieter, something internal begins to stir. Images appear without explanation. Ideas surface without effort. Connections form that logic alone could never construct. This is not imagination running wild. It is the unconscious finally being given space to speak in its own language. The tragedy is that modern life is hostile to this process. Constant input suffocates emergence. Endless information drowns intuition. When the mind is always reacting, it never descends. And without descent, creativity becomes imitation, rearranging what already exists instead of allowing something new to be born. Jung warned against this shallow productivity. He observed that many people remain clever but uncreative, busy but uninspired, knowledgeable but inwardly barren, because their lives never allow the unconscious to surface. Silence feels unproductive to them. Stillness feels like waste, and so they remain cut off from the very source that could renew them. Solitude restores access. When you are alone long enough, the mind stops chasing stimulation and begins to listen. Thoughts slow, attention turns inward, and gradually the unconscious begins to release material, not on command, but on its own terms. Dreams become vivid. Symbols repeat. Themes emerge. You start sensing patterns rather than forcing conclusions. This is how real ideas are born. Not through pressure, but through permission. The loner does not try to be creative. They create conditions in which creativity becomes inevitable. Silence removes interference. Boredom clears the surface. Observation deepens perception. And from this depth, originality arises naturally. Not as performance, but as expression. This is why so many artists, philosophers, inventors, and visionaries throughout history required solitude. Not because they disliked people, but because their work demanded access to something the crowd could not provide: uninterrupted contact with the unconscious. Jung believed that the unconscious compensates for what the conscious mind ignores. If your life is too rational, it brings images. If it is too social, it brings solitude. If it is too adapted, it brings disruption. Creativity is often this compensation made visible. The loner learns to respect this process instead of fearing it. They stop forcing answers. They stop demanding clarity prematurely. They allow confusion to exist long enough for insight to form organically. This patience is rare, and it is precisely what gives depth to their thinking. Over time, creativity stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like dialogue. A dialogue between consciousness and something deeper, between intention and emergence, between structure and mystery. This is why silence is not empty for the loner. It is crowded with potential. And when ideas finally surface, they carry a different weight. They are not reactive. They are not trendy. They are not borrowed. They feel inevitable, as if they were waiting for you to become quiet enough to hear them. The unconscious does not shout. It whispers. Only those who step away from noise long enough can hear it. This is the loner's creative advantage. They are not racing to produce. They are allowing something to be born. And in a world obsessed with speed, that depth becomes rare and powerful. 11. The dangerous individual. There is a reason societies instinctively distrust the person who is content in solitude, not hostile to others, not resentful, simply complete without constant reinforcement. Carl Jung understood that such a person represents a quiet threat, not because they seek conflict, but because they cannot be easily controlled. Control requires leverage, and leverage requires need. Most social systems function by exploiting fear, fear of rejection, fear of exclusion, fear of being alone. People comply because belonging feels safer than truth. They adjust their opinions, suppress their instincts, and betray their inner experience in exchange for acceptance. The tribe offers protection, but it demands obedience in return. The loner breaks this contract. When you are genuinely at ease with being alone, the tribe loses its most effective weapon. The threat of isolation no longer terrifies you. Disapproval loses its sting. Social pressure weakens. And without fear as leverage, manipulation fails. This is what makes the individual dangerous in Jung's sense. Not rebellious, not aggressive, but psychologically sovereign. Jung argued that true freedom does not come from opposing society directly, but from no longer needing it to regulate your inner world. The dangerous individual does not attack norms. They simply stop organizing their life around them. They no longer seek safety through conformity. They no longer anchor their worth in approval. Their sense of identity is internally sourced. This internal anchoring changes everything. You stop explaining yourself excessively. You stop chasing reassurance. You stop performing emotional compliance to avoid discomfort. Your yes becomes meaningful because your no is real. The dangerous individual cannot be mobilized through outrage cycles. They cannot be frightened into obedience by threats of exclusion. They cannot be bribed with validation or status. They listen, consider, and decide, but they do not dissolve into the collective emotional current. This does not make them antisocial, it makes them selective. They choose when to engage and when to withdraw. They participate without surrendering authorship. They stand among others without surrendering their center. This balance unsettles systems built on dependency because it reveals an alternative way of being, one that does not require constant supervision or emotional coercion. Jung saw this as essential for psychological health. A society composed entirely of well-adapted individuals may function smoothly, but it becomes fragile. It lacks conscience. It lacks creativity. It lacks resistance to destructive collective impulses. The dangerous individual provides that resistance, not through violence, but through non-participation in unconsciousness. They refuse to think on command. They refuse to feel on cue. They refuse to surrender responsibility for their inner life. This refusal is quiet, but profound. It allows the individual to remain human when systems push toward uniformity. It preserves depth in a culture obsessed with surface. It maintains ethical tension where blind obedience would otherwise dominate. The loner often does not realize this power at first. They simply know that crowds exhaust them, that noise distorts them, that silence restores them. Over time, however, they notice something else. They are harder to intimidate, harder to shame, harder to rush. Their decisions slow down, but they become firmer. Their presence becomes calmer, but more solid. This solidity is rare, and rarity attracts attention, not always positive. The dangerous individual is often misunderstood, labeled distant, unmotivated, arrogant, unambitious. But these labels are projections. They are attempts to categorize what cannot be easily absorbed. In truth, the dangerous individual has simply stepped outside the economy of fear and reward that governs most behavior. They are not fearless, they are fear literate. They know which fears are worth listening to and which are socially manufactured. They know that belonging purchased at the cost of authenticity is too expensive. And they know that being alone is far less dangerous than being unconsciously controlled. This is why Jung believed individuation was not just a personal task, but a cultural necessity. Without individuals who can stand alone psychologically, societies drift toward mass-mindedness, moral collapse, and emotional contagion. The loner, then, is not a failure of socialization. They are a corrective. They remind the world, by their mere existence, that a human being does not need constant approval to remain whole. That safety does not have to come from agreement. That strength does not require noise. A person who is happy alone is not weak. They are prepared. Prepared to think clearly under pressure, prepared to resist unconscious movements, prepared to act from principle rather than panic. This is the kind of individual every healthy society needs and every controlling system fears. Not because they fight, but because they cannot be owned. 12. Confronting the anima/animus. At a deeper stage of solitude, the psyche presents a confrontation that cannot be avoided without consequence, the encounter with the inner opposite. Carl Jung called these inner figures the anima in men and the animus in women. They are not metaphors. They are living psychic realities, autonomous patterns that shape attraction, emotion, imagination, and relationship without asking for consent. Most people never meet them consciously. They project them outward. A man searches endlessly for a woman who carries his sensitivity, intuition, and emotional depth. A woman becomes possessed by inner voices of judgment, authority, and rigid opinion, mistaking them for objective truth. Relationships become charged, obsessive, dramatic, not because love is intense, but because the inner partner has been mistaken for an outer one. This is why relationships often feel necessary rather than chosen. Solitude disrupts this illusion. When you step away from constant romantic or emotional entanglement, the projection collapses. There is no longer a convenient other onto whom the inner opposite can be placed. And so the anima or animus turns inward, demanding recognition. This is often experienced as emotional turbulence, vivid dreams, sudden mood shifts, or an unsettling sense of incompleteness. Many interpret this as loneliness. Jung saw it as initiation. The anima-animus confrontation is not about becoming less masculine or less feminine. It is about becoming balanced. The psyche seeks wholeness, not polarity. When the inner opposite is denied, it becomes tyrannical. When it is acknowledged and integrated, it becomes a guide. Solitude creates the conditions for this integration. Without distraction, you begin to notice inner dialogues you once avoided. You hear emotional tones that were drowned out by activity. You feel longings that were masked by attachment. This is the inner partner asking to be met. Not possessed, not indulged, but understood. Integration begins with relationship inward. You learn to listen to emotion without being overwhelmed by it. You learn to access logic without becoming rigid or cruel. You learn to hold tenderness and strength in the same psyche. This inner marriage changes everything. When the anima or animus is integrated, desperation fades. Attraction becomes clearer. You stop seeking completion through others. You are no longer unconsciously demanding that partners carry your unlived qualities. Love becomes lighter, less possessive, less idealized, less fragile. This is why Jung believed that mature love is impossible without inner balance. Unintegrated individuals do not relate, they project. They fall in love with images, not people. They hate traits that mirror their own disowned aspects. Relationships become battlegrounds for inner conflict, rather than spaces of connection. The loner steps out of this cycle. In solitude, they endure the discomfort of meeting themselves fully, They resist the urge to escape inner tension through immediate attachment. They allow the psyche to reorganize internally rather than outsourcing balance to relationships. This is not emotional withdrawal, it is emotional responsibility, and responsibility changes the quality of connection. Once the inner marriage stabilizes, you no longer need others to feel complete. You choose them. You're not driven by hunger, fear, or fantasy. You are capable of intimacy without dependence, closeness without collapse. Jung saw this as a crucial milestone in individuation.